All right, going now. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Dunbar. I'm the mayor of the town of Yountville and president of the League of California Cities. I want to welcome you to the webinar that's being hosted by the League, as well as the Department of General Services and the Department of Housing and Community Development. As the League's new president, this year I plan to take challenges head on, and that includes the housing crisis that we are experiencing throughout California. The League looks forward to working in partnership with the Newsom administration in carrying out the Governor's Executive Order, N0619, which aims to identify and prioritize excess state-owned property for housing. For example, in a way that I think we can look at this from the local city official perspective, in my town of Yountville, which is in the North Bay region of San Francisco, it's a very rural community in the Napa Valley wine country, but I've been working with leadership in the Departments of Veterans Affairs, General Services, Housing and Community Development, and the Governor's Office to bring housing to underutilized sections of the 600-plus acre California Veterans Home campus that's located right in our small community. We've identified locations on the property that are suitable for housing, and the town has committed $100,000 for a feasibility study to create housing that could serve employees and homeless veterans, as well as other demographics. So this would be an example of how we can be looking at this at the local level and how we can take advantage of the Governor's executive order. It's my hope that cities look at this as an opportunity for state and local governments to work in collaboration with the housing construction sector to help identify the viability of building cost-effective and more affordable housing on excess state property, because this will remove what is typically the most expensive element of housing construction, which is the land cost. And the state is, under Governor Newsom, prepared to step forward with that support, and at the local level, we should be preparing ourselves to take full advantage of that. I would like to now welcome Jason Kenny, Deputy Director, Real Estate Services Division of the Department of General Services, who is on this call, as well as Maggie Tabor, Specialist Division of Financial Assistance in Housing and Community Development. They will be leading the webinar and the execution of the Governor's Executive Order. So thank to everyone who is on this call, and I will now turn it over to Jason and Maggie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Dunbar. Much appreciated. Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Kenny. I'm going to walk you through the executive order. One quick point of housekeeping to start. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in. We're trying to avoid the cacophony of voices. So type it in, and if I can answer it organically throughout the presentation, I will do that. Otherwise, we can answer them at the end. But the goal today is to walk you through the executive order, kind of what we did, why we've done it, the initial elements of success. It was with the cities of Sacramento and Stockton, and kind of what's on the horizon in general. I do want to make an effort and point to talk about our future partnerships, potential partnerships together, what that might look like between you guys on the local jurisdiction end and us at the state level, and kind of how we see this going using Stockton and Sacramento as examples. So excited to walk you through kind of why this is unusual for us. But Executive Order N619 is a brand new thing that has never happened in the history of state government, not to undersell it. But basically what occurs every year is state departments, and actually there's a lot of state property owned in California by the state of California itself, and it's owned on behalf of the, it's managed on behalf of the state by numerous departments. Those departments do not have ownership intrinsically themselves. They are considered stewards of the property. The property is held in trust, essentially. And statutorily, there's really no incentive for those departments to do much with the property beyond use it for its mission. Meaning, if you are I'll pick on one of our larger campus departments. If you are the Department of State Hospitals and you've got an 800-acre campus somewhere, theoretically, there's a lot of things you could do with that property, but it doesn't behoove you to sell it, lease it, et cetera. None of the revenue would actually go to the department, and there's liability attached to it. And so typically those pieces of property sit and they are utilized to whatever degree they need to be by those departments. But we're not super proactively innovative with state-owned property in general. What the executive order requires the state to do, in that same context, every year departments are required to say, I no longer need this piece of property, please, Department of General Services, DGS, go do something with it. What ultimately occurs is because of that lack of incentivization, there are 1, 2 parcels declared excess a year, a big year is 4. So it's pretty rare that we have a whole lot of state property that can be put to alternate use. So the executive order said, let's kind of buck the trend, and let's actually have the Department of General Services and HCD go out and proactively review every piece of state-owned property on the roster and really look at it from 2 perspectives. Perspective 1, whether or not the property is currently being utilized to its fullest intent. In some cases, the property is not being utilized at all. In some cases, it is being utilized, but it's underutilized for its size, location, that sort of thing. And then the second bucket really is the ability to build housing on the site. Is it something where it's at a pretty massive grade, and so you're never going to build anything on it? Is it so rural, it's literally in the middle of a forest somewhere, or it is a forest, or in some cases it's a lake, and obviously you're not building housing in those places. So what is apparently underutilized, and what is conducive to housing? And that's what the executive order required. And included in that then was after we identified this initial inventory of sites, and I'll talk about what that inventory looks like and how many sites we looked at and the whole thing in a second. But as we look at that inventory of sites and we identify all these parcels that apparently are not utilized and are conducive to housing, then we would go and we would work with the departments who have jurisdiction of the property and sort of challenge them on it. There's a piece of property here that you do not appear to be utilizing fully or at all. Please tell us why this property couldn't be repurposed for housing, and work with them to, and in some of these cases, these sites are going to have things like encumbrances that have 15 easements on it, long-term easements, perpetual easements. It might have remediation issues. It might have been escheated to the state 100 years ago for a very specific purpose and would require an act of the legislature, or potentially even the permission of a trust to utilize for an alternate purpose. And so without knowing all those things, that's why we go back to the department and work with them on it. The executive order also requires us to then take parcels that the departments have agreed are access to their needs and can be repurposed for housing and systematically develop housing on it. We have existing authority in statute to enter into long-term ground leases, which I'll also cover in a little bit. And so we would utilize that authority to take those excess properties and start developing them. In addition to all of that, the executive order also calls out an emphasis on partnership with local governments. We recognize fully that any developments that we're talking about is literally in someone's backyard. It's not like the state of California exists apart from local government entities, and so we would be wanting to partner with and collaborate with those entities whose properties that we're working on in terms of developments. And then a big focus of the executive order as well is doing this on an expedited basis as fast as we reasonably can. So that's in a high nutshell is what the executive order really contemplated. As I alluded to, there were a number of steps outlined in the EO that we followed. DGS conducted the initial inventory of sites for those 2 big buckets I mentioned. Concurrently, by department as well as HCD, Housing Community Development, developed a screening tool. The screening tool's job was to help us prioritize and essentially take those parcels that looked like they were good for housing and looked like they were underutilized, identify whether or not they actually met some pretty core housing criteria. Things like adjacency to transportation, comparing that to local housing production or underproduction, as the case may be. And in a few slides, Meiji will kind of go through and talk about what that screening tool looks like and kind of how we applied it. After those properties were identified and screened, as I mentioned, we talked with the apartments. From there, we have begun and are still working on a global site prioritization. We then published a heat map that showed all the sites that we have yeses for, and again, I'll kind of cover that in a little more detail in a second. And that announces to the world the places where we have intention to build housing. That it's just that, it's an intention. Things can change. It may turn out that site is just absolutely non-viable for a number of reasons, but those are all places where we've got the yes and preparing to move forward. And then we have contemplated and received funding in the last budget cycle for some initial real estate due diligence for the sites, which will also cover kind of as our tee-up. And then the final step for us is to start issuing RFPs. We've done the first two, and we will do this on a cycle in perpetuity, essentially, until the sites that are available are used up or otherwise eliminated. So what did we look at? There were 44,370 state pieces of land evaluated pursuant to the executive order. Some of these are pretty significantly sized parcels. Some are quite small, but 44,370 across all jurisdictions in California. As I mentioned, these were visual reviews, so we're looking for grading, utilization, adjacencies. I mean, certainly a site that's next to residential is far better than a site that's in the middle of a commercial industrial zone. Like I said, we eliminated those that were in more commercial areas, but we did obviously look at those types of adjacencies as part of our review. We also looked at, in some cases, alternate development opportunities, meaning sites where perhaps the state over-purchased land when the initial development was done. So let's just use an employee development department office, a field office for EDD. Perhaps the site needed was 5 acres, and the state purchased 8, thinking that 8 was needed at the time. So now there's 3 acres adjacent to that parcel that's maybe it's a field, maybe it's part of the parking lot, whatever the case may be, looking at seeing if there's a way of sort of reutilizing some of those. There are some existing motor vehicle DMV offices that we have existing legislation that allows us to sort of repurpose, relook at, relocate. So those went into the look as well. So we did all of that on those 44,370. What resulted was 1,300 parcels statewide that we felt fell into the category of underutilized and appropriate for housing. Since talking about parcels isn't necessarily the clearest way of doing it, we kind of pivoted to a site designation. So if I've got 4 parcels adjacent to each other, not separated by a road, not separated by a creek, but literally just 4 in a row, it's probably better to think of that as a site as opposed to 4 parcels. We found the terminology got a little confusing. So we pivoted to our site conversation. So the 1,330 parcels translated into about 550 sites. And that's what we then began vetting with the departments to identify those that truly are excess. Sorry, I got a note that the sound of the speaker is very muffled and we're having difficulty understanding him. If I talk louder, is that better? Can you, this is from Liz, can you hear me better, or is it still muffled?
Yeah, I actually have one suggestion. If you're calling in and listening through the webinar online, that may not be as clear as if you just dialed in from a landline phone, because I know that that's usually clearer. So you can try that instead and see if that works better for you.
I'll definitely try to talk louder as well. Hopefully that between those two things it works. But anyways, yeah, so 550 sites. We began vetting with departments. And that was actually supplemented with some input from local governments. A number of entities, county, city, reached out to us during our process from January to July and proposed additional sites. In some cases, actually, and that was a pretty interesting wake-up call for us. There were a number of parcels that we were going to eliminate because they frankly had terrible adjacencies. Even though they were underutilized, they just didn't seem to be viable for housing at all. They didn't score well in HCD screening criteria. But the local government reached out and said, you know what, this would be a fantastic land swap. We want it for some alternate purpose, and we would like to pick it up and trade you parcels. Or in some cases, the parcel that we had was really irregularly shaped and wouldn't have worked for development, but the local government actually owned the two adjacent parcels and proposed a sort of a co-development with us. And so as we were going through this process and as those reach outs happened, we realized that our screening process alone is probably not sufficient, and that we would need to make sure that we were sort of doing a round two of this in partnership with local entities, legislative members, and whomever else throughout the process. So, but regardless, the sites that were viewed by us and were suggested by local entities were then vetted with departments, and there are about 100 ultimately that we got to yeses on. If you, I know going from 41,370 parcels to 100 sites doesn't seem like a huge amount. I did note a couple things. One, that's 100 more than we've ever had before. But two, the vast majority of state-owned property in California tends to be natural resource focused, so swamps, lakes, beaches, forests, those sorts of things. It's a massive swath of the property that we control. So, coming up with 100 sites out of what is actually developable it was a decent percentage. One question that inevitably comes up is are you done? And the answer is no. I'm going to talk a little bit about this round two that I just alluded to with local governments. But in addition to that, every year there's at least, generally one or two parcels that are declared excess. And so those will go through a similar screening process, and we'll be folding that into the executive order on an ongoing permanent basis moving forward. In addition to that, there are a number of sites that, we went from 550 down to 100. So there are a number of sites that we thought were underutilized and viable that department said no on. Some of those no's make a great deal of sense. They were remediation sites. They were escheated to the state. They were heavily encumbered with very difficult to remove encumbrances. Sure. But there were some that we feel are appealable, and so we're going to be going through that process as well with the state departments. So this number we expect to be in flux, and it'll change from time to time. Obviously, as we develop sites, they will fall off, but we do expect this number to go up and down over time, and we view this as a permanent future process for us as opposed to a one-off. This next slide, for those of you watching on the computer, is an example. This is actually the Sacramento site that we issued our first RFP against. I'm sorry, it's not technically an RFP because of the way the statute for this site worked, but in essence, this is the site that we identified as for our first RFP. We simply didn't need to issue one. It gives you an example of the kind of parcels that the state owns. For those familiar in Sacramento, this is, generally speaking, in a State Department heavy series of streets. It's called the Capital Area. But that said, this is a fairly irregular shaped parcel with an existing, it's technically conference space, right next to an office building that's leased. This gives you a sense and flavor, I think, for some of the oddities the state owns. This would be perfectly suitable for micro units, which is what we're pursuing here. But again, this just gives you an image of the type of thing that you'd see kind of randomly throughout the state, especially in downtown urban areas. The state owns some odd pieces of property. So I'm going to transition to the screening tools. I promise I'm going to come back to this round two issue with local governments. I think it's really important, especially for this call, and to talk about how we can partner not just in future development, but the identification of future development sites. But before I do that, let's turn it over to HCD to talk about just the screening tool and how that was approached and what the results were.
Great. So as Jason mentioned, part of the implementation of the executive order was a screening tool that we would apply to the sites that we identified. Part of the screening tool was laid out in the executive order, so we started from there. we were looking at housing need and economic feasibility. For housing need, we were very interested in where housing was most needed and it would be most impactful. And so the factor that went into those screening tools was the availability of affordable housing, and this really covers the availability of affordable housing in the job and commute shed. We also looked at the gap between supply and demand, and specifically where the gap between regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA, and building permits issued is greater than 1,500 units. So we're looking at a significant gap in housing. And then we also looked at the rate of increase in rent. So we looked at where the median gross rent increased by more than 5% from 2016 to 2017 using American Community Survey data. We also looked at the economic feasibility and applied that screening tool. We wanted to understand the possibility of a project and its feasibility, and in order to do this, we looked at the site, building off of DGS's original analysis that focused on the physical attributes of the site. As Jason mentioned, not all of these sites are suitable for housing. Some are underwater, some have very steep slopes. So we built off that initial analysis and looked at additional factors, such as the proximity to job centers. So we were interested in understanding census tracts, where the number of jobs filled by workers was less than adapters that fall within a given radius. So that was determined by the typical commute distance for low-income workers in each region. We also looked at the proximity to education, and that was identifying census tracts where education composite indicator is within the top quintile statewide, so high-performing schools. And then finally, we looked at the proximity to high-frequency public transit. And this is within any area in the state that is within a half mile of high-frequency public transit stops. So in addition to the housing need, we were interested in those other factors that might point to areas of opportunity that would be ideal for affordable housing.
All right, thank you. So all of that to say, we looked at state property, we winnowed it down, we got departments to agree to give up pieces of property, you published that. That publication includes those a map showing the screening factors that Meji just mentioned, and now we're at the place where we are looking to begin development. So what does that actually mean? What's the development approach we're taking? They are state developments. We are not planning necessarily on selling the properties off, with one big caveat. Our map does include properties that have already been declared surplus by the legislature. Without getting too into the weeds, going back to my original speech on departments having land in trust, once the department says they don't need it anymore, it's technically an excess piece of property at that point, and we can transfer the property to another state agency who might have need of it. But if it's not needed by anybody in the state, whether for a long-term lease or for more permanent use, we then would seek legislative authorization to dispose of the property, and those sites are termed surplus to our needs. And so we're not obligated once something is declared surplus to actually go through that route. We could still pull it back, we could still transfer, we could still reutilize it, we could still lease it. It simply enables us to dispose of the property more permanently. There were a number of existing surplus sites that have languished over the years. My favorite example is former Southern Youth Correctional Facility in Norwalk. It is a 40-plus acre site in the city of Norwalk that is fenced off, literally. And so it's something that was languished for years, and CDCR, Department of Correction, has been paying warm shutdown costs on it, and the executive order was able to shake that loose, and we're looking to do something with that site again. Because it's authorized as existing surplus, we could go the long-term ground lease route, or we could go a sale route. So there are some sites, limited number, very limited number, but there are some sites that we have the ability to do something other than the approach I'm about to lay out for you. Curiously enough, those tend to be the sort of the biggest sites that we have. So it's a whole interesting bag of mix here. But in general, what the executive order lays out is a state development. So retaining on state land, we're not selling it off. We would do a long-term ground lease. The ground lease would be to a developer. who would build, own, and operate the improvements. We would leverage state property values, so long-term leases up to 99 years for nominal amounts, even $1. The only requirement we have in statute is to cost recover the administrative cost of executing the lease and the annual cost for that, whatever those may be. Because the staff that we're using are otherwise covered by other fund sources, we expect these to all be essentially up to 99-year leases with per $1. We are looking for developments that are as innovative as possible, and so, certainly someone can propose traditional stick frame construction, but whether that's modular or manufactured housing, things like mass timber, repurposed shipping containers, micro unit, tiny homes. We're looking for things that will generate high yield to the extent possible. Bear in mind, we have some of these sites where tiny homes might be the only thing that's actually appropriate for them. We're looking at high yield. We're also looking at doing this in a way that spurs the industry, that serves as a model, and gets us to faster construction. The executive order also calls out both sustainable and equitable construction as well, so making sure that we're doing it in a way that is green and sustainable and is not done inappropriately on the backs of workers, meaning prevailing wage requirements, those sorts of things. So that's kind of the development approach in general. The executive order calls out a number of other things. This is a good time maybe to circle back to our 2.0 discussion with local government entities. So the executive order, if you were to read through it, does talk about land swaps. I mentioned that was something that was pitched to us by at least one jurisdiction earlier. But in the context of the executive order, as we've been going through the properties, as we have engaged with some number of local entities, most of whom have reached out to us as opposed to the reverse, we've begun realizing that, yes, co-developments are something that we should look hard at doing. Again, maybe our parcel is not conducive to it, but a private entity and or city or county owns a piece of property next to ours that together something could be done meaningful with. We also have realized that every single local entity out there is generally aware of state property in their backyard. Maybe not every piece, but generally speaking, you're aware of at least some of the state property that's out there. And curiously too, just for everybody we've talked to has some piece of state property that they've been eyeing for years as well. Maybe it's a blighted piece of land that nothing's happened on, it's been fenced off for the last half decade. Maybe it's something where it's just an incongruous development given the area, whatever the case may be. And so those are sites where theoretically we would have flagged them. We would have run them through our process, run them through the departments and got an answer back. But it's always possible that something was just missed in general, something was inappropriately screened out, or that we got a no from the department and it's something we need to push back on. And so what we are not just throwing out there as a possibility, but actively encouraging is those conversations that kind of come up through us. And so, if there are pieces of property in your backyard that meet those descriptions, it's something that you think would be appropriate for housing. You're not seeing it on our heat map. You want to know why. You want to challenge why. Those are conversations that we are not just interested in having, but want to have. We don't want to leave any stones unturned. And it's possible too that there were very good reasons as to why that site could not be turned into housing or put on the heat map as a yes site. That's perfectly fine to have that conversation, but we definitely don't want to leave any stone unturned, and so we're looking for that kind of partnership. I already mentioned leveraging existing state surplus. That is something else that we're doing. Again, that does offer an alternate path forward on some of these sites. Half of a lease, half of a sale. The authority for surplus property is actually pretty broad. Once it's declared to be surplus, our ability to dispose of the property is large, and so it offers us an ability to do something a little more creative than the long-term ground leases. The last thing to highlight, I think, in the executive order is that there is mention of prioritized funding for these developments. Now, certainly we don't control tax credits and things like that, but there are a number of state fund sources that are being looked at. It's a little premature to speak to specific details. I think we're still kind of figuring it out a little bit ourselves. But there is a signaled intention on our part to look hard at potentially prioritizing some of those state funds for these state developments, or state developments on state property. So I mentioned that we're now in the RFP stage, and so the first technical formal RFP that we issued was Foresight in Stockton. It's property currently under the jurisdiction of the State Controller's Office. That property is a pretty major thoroughfare, actually, surprisingly, in the city of Stockton. It's actually it borders two different streets, so it looks like it's two different sites, but it's really kind of one property. It's just fascinating that we own this. But we issued an RFP on September 30th. The plan there is, and what we think we can do in the context of local zoning and density, is to develop over 100 units, but probably seeing that as the floor. And we're looking to select the developers sometime this January. Reason why I highlight that is if you are interested, that RFP is posted on our website. It's also posted on the state's contract register, which is eProcure, E-P-R-O-C-U-R-E. That is where we'll be posting all of these RFPs. What HCD has done is amplify that by sending it out to their various distribution lists. We've had a number of developers, local government entities, others reach out to us and ask to be CC'd on things. So we're kind of creating our own version of a listserv as well. We're trying to blanket this far and wide, but if you wanted to sort of see kind of how we're approaching this, feel free to take a look at that RFP and give it a gander. With the caveat, though, of course, that we fully expect to learn as we go. We are already planning on modifying our RFP template, and so the next one's going to be looking fairly different. But again, it gives you a sense for flavor of kind of where our head's at, how we're evaluating these things, how we're looking at state funding sources and driving affordability and that sort of thing. One other element I think it's important to note on the Stockton RFP is the partnership with the city. So we didn't just, inform Stockton that we're going to be issuing an RFP in the backyard. There were several conversations that happened in advance of that, including a discussion as to what's appropriate for that site and for that area. We want to have conversations not just about whether or not what we're aiming at is the right thing for the area, but we also want to better understand, local community interests, concerns, support. If there was a development attempt, 6 blocks down the road that died a slow, horrible CEQA-related death, for example, that's all great information for us to know, kind of factor in any lessons learned. In the case of Stockton actually is waiving fees, city fees and things like that for development. And so, coming to that understanding, being able to, either put that in the RFP or factor it into sort of the yield analysis that we're doing, all of that is incredibly useful. And so we partner with the city. They reviewed the RFP prior to it going out. And we think this is a good model for future developments as well. One thing I should note, because I just mentioned zoning, I just mentioned density, I just mentioned what's appropriate for the area. Technically speaking, as state developments, in the same way that local governments can't regulate the state unless explicitly allowed for in statute, so too are developments not technically subject to zoning and density and planning commission reviews and all that sort of stuff at the local level. It would be subject to state permitting, state reviews, state approvals. My department would serve as lead agency for CEQA, that sort of thing. However, we fully recognize that the people who build housing in your backyards are typically not us. And so the idea of partnering with you on things like plan reviews, inspections, keeping within density and zoning requirements, or working with you to change those as appropriate, those are all part of the partnership we're looking to have. Again, our intention is not to ram anything down anyone's throats. It is to come in and kind of lock hands with you as we do these developments. But I'd be remiss if I didn't note that technically we're not subject to those things. hopefully that's an encouragement and not a detriment to some of you, but that is sort of the fact of it. So ultimately, next steps. We are ongoingly working on our site list, so going back and doing the appeals, as local jurisdictions are pointing out properties, investigating those, that sort of thing. We are doing communication outreach like this, and really want to make sure we're setting up those local partnerships. We're also wanting to program that out a little bit so that we can say, all right, an RFP is going to go out on this day, and so we should be reaching out to the city 2 months in advance, and making sure it's a little more rote than ad hoc each time. We'll be constantly updating our map. That'll be a dynamic process, and of course, prioritizing which sites are going to go out when is probably our next most critical task. We are probably going to use the starting place, something along the lines of the screening tool that was developed. We may play with the weights a little bit and do that sort of thing. That's probably how you'll see the prioritization, at least have a first cut. Obviously, jurisdictions that are interested in having us come in and work with them on housing, that should be a factor as well. And so if that's you, please reach out, let us know. We'd love to understand who wants to be a partner with us on that. And I think finally, our approach with these RFPs, you're not going to see anything issued essentially between now and January. We're not planning on doing one a month or something along those lines. What we're hoping really to do is now we have this first Stockton one out, and as we're retooling the RFP for the next round, we also want to gain some lessons learned. Did we botch the scoring, for example? Did we, whether that's because it was too restrictive or not restrictive enough? Did our distribution of the RFP fall flat? Whatever the case may be, we want to get our druthers. We want to learn some lessons here, and then retool. After that's done, then yes, we are expecting to have these done at a fairly regular clip. Staffing, resources being what they are, I probably wouldn't expect more than a couple a quarter. And it'll all just depend, obviously, on timing. We are trying to make sure that our RFPs, to the extent possible, are appropriate and in accordance with existing funding cycles. So if we definitely don't want to issue an RFP and get responses in, and then turn around and have developers only have 2 weeks to put in for some fund source. So if we can avoid that, so we're looking at all those things in our cycle, but we do expect to have RFPs kind of going out at a regular clip. And unless I missed my mark, I think that's the end of my presentation, the last slide. So I guess opening up to questions, if there are any. Any feedback? Anything? Since some folks will be typing, we'll give them a second. But if there's no feedback or no questions, that's totally fine too. Oh, got one. Question came in: how do we get involved in the second round of property evaluations? And second related question: what is the best way to reach out and contact you about properties on the list? Fantastic question. Really. Taking them together, one, I will make sure that we provide the league here with the appropriate contact information from the people and my staff who are involved in the process. I will make sure, and they'll be the ones, they're the ones who are going to serve points on interfacing with local government entities. So we'll get the names, we'll get emails, we'll get telephone numbers. There is also, though, an email address we created, affordable housing at dgs.ca.gov. We'll make sure that generally gets out as well. It's an all-purpose email for questions that are a little more ad hoc. But for those of you who want to meet about specific properties, we'll give you more specific people to talk through. But the goal ultimately is for you to get this information and reach out to us. If you've got a particular site that you want to talk about and partner on, or just a question as to whether something is going to go out by a certain date, that's maybe not a meeting, but that's just a quick email exchange or phone call. If there are sites that you're interested in partnering on specifically, that would be good to know sooner than later as we're going through this prioritization exercise. And then if there are sites that you wish that we had considered but we hadn't, please, that's another good conversation. Maybe it's a medium-term thing as well, because we can fold that into our appeals process. So definitely we'll get you contact information to reach out. And that's the best way to get involved in the second round, regardless of whether you want to challenge a site on the list, you want to partner on the list, you want to add something to it, but reach out to us, let us know, and we'll start scheduling phone calls and meetings accordingly. Another question came in, is the inventory database updated and complete? If there are no sites identified in our city, but we know a property available, who do we contact to get it considered? So very similar answer. The inventory will always be dynamic. The inventory is simply those sites we've got yeses to. If we had 550 sites and we've got 100 yeses, there are about 450 that we're still looking at in terms of appeals. But if there is something that you think should be on the list and isn't, when we get you those contact information, those names and numbers, reach out, flag it for us, and we can either tell you why it was rejected, or let you know that it's still in the appeals process, or hopefully not, find out we missed it entirely, and we'll go through the same process to identify it and work with the department to hopefully get to a yes. Another question, how can a local agency provide comments on the selected site? Same process, we'll get you names and numbers, please let us know. And then another question, how would the site be subject to CEQA? Yes, as a governmental entity taking governmental action, CEQA is applicable. As many of you do not know, there are some exemptions, categorical exemptions related to housing for CEQA. Some of our sites, as we preliminarily looked at them, would qualify for those exemptions, others would not. DGS would serve as lead agency for CEQA evaluations. And we do that for all state projects anyways. My office has about 450 active construction projects at any point in time. Those are just state projects. We do CEQA for all of them, as well as permitting and the whole 9 yards. So very practiced at it, also very reasonable at it, if I do say so myself. Hopefully other folks agree. But yes, it is still subject to CEQA. Other questions? Yes, the city general plan apply. Technically, the answer to that is, in terms of our ability to build and be subject to local requirements, no, it does not apply. Does it apply to other areas? Potentially, yes. So, for example, one of those exemptions for housing I mentioned under CEQA is that it has to be consistent with local planning. And so if we're planning on doing something that's inconsistent with it, then obviously the local plan does apply. But if you're asking if your plan says that it is zoned for, say, commercial, not residential, whether or not that would legally stop us from doing development, the answer would be no. That wouldn't apply to us. Again, our approach is to be collaborative and not dictatorial, and so we absolutely want to have those conversations and kind of go from there, but not as a legal requirement. Another question, did you evaluate university properties? Great question. So there are a number of state entities that are outside of the executive branch's direct control, for lack of a better word. Basically, they're part of state government, but they don't necessarily report up through the governor. The UC and CSUs kind of work in that zone. There are state constitutional offices that fall into that category as well. We did look at those properties. We did do an analysis on them. Those conversations have been punted to those entities as we don't have the same sort of access or control over their properties. And so you won't see university properties, for example, on our map That doesn't say that there aren't sites that they have that would be conducive for housing. It simply means that we don't work with them the same way that we would, say, the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Corrections or the State Hospitals or the Veterans Affairs, those types of departments that are more intrinsically part of the executive branch. All right. Other questions? If you feel, by the way, if you asked a question, I didn't answer it, or didn't answer what you intended me to answer, feel free to reframe. It's always possible I misunderstood something. As you may or may not be typing, one thing to add, we have a DGS website where the heat map is located. We'll make sure that goes out to everyone as well, so you actually have that link just in case you don't have it. It's probably displayed, but it's not necessarily one click away on our website. So we'll make sure we get you the actual URL itself. One question, we just wanted to confirm before the end of the webinar that you'll be providing contact information. The simplest contact information we have is affordablehousing@dgs.ca.gov. That's affordablehousing@dgs.ca.gov. That I can absolutely give out now, but the staff email and phone numbers that actually don't have memorized. So we'll make sure we get it to the lead folks here in Sacramento to distribute out to everybody on the call. Next question, how have you evaluated right-of-way properties which were not parcelized in the traditional way? With difficulty is probably the snarky answer to that. The properties that were under the jurisdiction of Caltrans, there's a distinction between the properties that they have for related highway use and then things that were under their jurisdiction more for direct highway use. In other words, as overpass was built 15 years ago, they had a laydown space area, and the laydown space area happened to be 5 blocks away from the construction of the ramp, and that's stayed under their books. And that's something that's very much different than property that's adjacent to freeways where there's not necessarily an address to it, and the parcelization is a little less clear. So what we did with Caltrans was we did our best, is the simplest way of putting it, looking at, and I should say we actually pulled county assessor data to validate, not just looked at state property records, and so that was the main source of our data. That was useful. But then we actually worked more directly with Caltrans. They maintain their own list of excess property that they cycle through, and so our list and their list, we kind of punted each other's lists over the table, a little bit over the wall, and we evaluated theirs, they evaluated ours, and what shook out was what's on the map. So it was done hand in hand with Caltrans. It is difficult, I'm not going to lie. It's entirely possible that something was missing. That's why it's so important that we have this sort of round 2 with the locals, because it's easy for us to have neglected something or just miss something because, again, there's no address for the site, and it may not even be in county assessor records, because that's another problem that we're seeing is our own state property records aren't exactly 100%, and not only the county assessor data not 100%, but different counties take different care in recording state-owned property, and so in some cases the information is sparse. Let's take a follow-up question. Does Caltrans provide a map of directed deed properties that local agencies might evaluate recommendations for future assessment? No, we have not published any sort of omnibus property map for Caltrans. I'm not aware of what they may do for their own surplus excess property in terms of posting. I can try to get an answer to that and get back to you guys on it. They may do something kind of as a matter of course, but for the purposes of the executive order, the only thing you'll ever see published from us are sites that we believe are conducive to housing and the department has said yes on. We're not necessarily publishing an inventory of everything else. That said, also on our website, we have what's called the State Property Inventory. It is a GIS-enabled map of all reported state-owned properties. The biggest sort of deficit of information in that map is Caltrans parcels. Things that are associated for highway use have not been perfectly reported over the years, so you can't really rely on that for some of the Caltrans stuff. For those of you not looking at Caltrans properties, not looking at those sort of transportation properties, everything else should be on there pretty accurately. But yeah, I'll try to get back to you on what might happen for Caltrans in their normal course of business. But again, for the heat map, all that's on there are the stuff that is a true yes. I hope I'm answering that question. Any other questions? While you may or may not be copying, just to recap, we'll get you contact information, we'll get you websites, and including the link to our Stockton RFP, and then I'll do my best to kind of track down the Caltrans thing, what they may or may not post, but we'll get you the information that we promised at least. Maybe give folks one more minute. All right, well, seeing as the last question was 5 minutes ago, I'm assuming then that there aren't any additional ones. I really appreciate you all taking the time to hear me ramble on about the executive order. We are really looking forward to working with you all. Hopefully everyone has property in their backyard that's state-owned, that's on the map, but we're looking forward to working with everybody about these developments. It is something new and exciting. We definitely want to help put a dent into the deficit of housing across California. One little tiny plug I may say as well, we are currently talking about potentially procedurizing some of what we did. So for those of you who might be interested in doing sort of a screen of what's in your own backyard with your own properties. We'd be happy to talk about what that might look like. But we see this was a lot of work. It was 9 people dedicated full-time for 3 months to do the reviews, but that was 44,000 parcels. We think this is replicatable, and if you're interested, we'd be happy to show you how and go from there. But otherwise, we'll look forward to working with you on the sites we've identified and the housing developments. So again, thank you for the time.